thank you so much for inviting me to come today to talk to you. My name is Melissa Rogerson. I'm an academic teaching specialist at the University of Melbourne, and as Sarah said, I am also part of Boardgames Australia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Boardgames Australia shortly, what we do and why perhaps we'll be a good resource for you as toy libraries. My background or my qualifications, I suppose, to be here and talking about board games, the prominent one is, I suppose, that I have a PhD in hobbyist board games and people's approaches to them and the way that they feel about board games. But I'm also a board game hobbyist myself, so I have a lot of knowledge that I've built up over many years of playing games. Playing games, of talking about games. And not on here, but probably also very relevant, I have 2 children, right? They're a bit older than your core market these days, but they've grown up playing games. So I have a lot of experience playing games with children and teaching children about games. I've run a lot of family board game nights, family board game clubs as well. And I've also worked as a game translator, and I do quite a bit of work with the media talking about board games. So for those of you who are in Melbourne, starting the 20th of May, I'm going to be talking board games every second Monday on ABC Radio at 2:30 in the afternoon, and taking talkback from people as well. So when we talk about board games, one of the things that quickly becomes clear when we look at the way that board games are receiving attention is that something is happening. Okay, if I quote Paul Booth, we're in the midst of a board game renaissance. In other words, board games are being reinvented and redeveloped and experiencing this massive rise in popularity. I liked these 3 media articles, right? The rise of tabletop gaming. Millennials are driving the board games revival, and it's official, everyone, board games are cool now. So that's always nice. Now, of course, the oldest board game that we know about and that still exists is Senet. Senet was played in ancient Egypt, and game boards have been dated back to about 3,500 BCE. So that makes it about 5,500 years old. So we know that there has been this long interest in playing games. Some of the games that we think of as being very old are certainly, compared to Senet, they're relative newcomers. So chess, the way that we play it now, dates probably from about 1300, although it's been dated back to earlier than that. Go goes back to about 2000 BCE, so it's about 4,000 years old. And games like Nine Men's Morris or Mill, sometimes it's called Morels, go back to ancient Rome, possibly around 1400 BCE, so again about 3,500 years old. One of the things I love about Mill is that if you travel particularly around the UK, you will find that people who were building cathedrals and who were building other kind of buildings that have stayed with us until now often like to play this in their spare time. So I think it's Salisbury Cathedral has a particularly famous kind of, one of the stone carvings has a mill board etched into the back of it, and you can see it there. I'm not sure whether that's graffiti or gameplay and how we should feel about that. And of course backgammon was a really popular game with the ancient Romans as well. And we know that dice games in particular tended to be gambling games early on. So there are lots and lots and lots of dice. When you find shipwrecks, when you find other Roman artefacts, you tend to find a lot of dice. We think Mahjong is probably quite a traditional game. Actually, Mahjong's probably less than 200 years old, maybe around 150. Okay? Contract bridge was invented in 1925. So again, we think of it as a traditional game. It's not. On the other hand, games like, who's played Trouble, right? Did we all grow up with the Pop-O-Matic, which was the main purpose of playing Trouble? Games like Trouble is actually an implementation of a game called Ludo, which is an ancient Indian game. And Snakes and Ladders which is, I think, very much maligned as a game, is actually an ancient Indian game. It's called Gyan Chorpa, pardon my pronunciation, and particularly in the Jain religion, this was a game about achieving enlightenment, but it was also a game about the randomness of life. So you rolled dice to progress. You didn't have any choices about how you progressed because life's just like that. And you'll notice on the left there's an ancient board and there's rather more snakes than ladders on that one. But this was a game that was kind of appropriated by the Victorians, right? When there was a massive English presence in India, they saw this game, they took it back to England and then to the rest of the world. And if you find an older copy, now I bought this board about 16 years ago, so you could certainly still find it. When you look at it closely, it's about morality tales, okay? So it's kind of hard to see on the slides, but, you know, where the little girl is nice to her brother and shares something with him, she then gets to go up a ladder. And the top of the snakes tends to be the 7 deadly sins. Now, we've lost that a lot in a lot of the copies that are sold, but you can see that sort of move from a game about, I suppose, karma and about achieving enlightenment. The better a life you lived, the higher you would progress, into this game about really very Victorian morality standards. And this is H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, playing Little Wars. Okay, this was a very early war game which was played with tin soldiers, and war games have a very long history. And you still see people playing this type of game with miniatures, little miniature figures, often intricately crafted. They often have painting competitions, which I think is delightful because I haven't coloured anything in for years, but they often have a prize, in fact, for the best painted army in these competitions. And officer training schools around the world use war games and simulations to teach military manoeuvres and military strategies. But then when we think of mass market games, right, this is the one that everybody knows. Probably most of us grew up playing Monopoly, and it's credited as being invented in 1933 by Charles Darrow. It was an instant success in the UK and in the US. If anyone's ever wondered why the Angel Islington, which is a pub, is one of the streets on the board, supposedly it's because when the chair of the company that was producing the game in the UK and his PA finished their taxi tour around London to select the streets, they ended up having a drink at the Angel Islington. But of course, Monopoly wasn't invented by Charles Darrow at all. Monopoly was invented by Elizabeth Phillips, or Elizabeth McGee, in about 1903. She called it the landlord's game, and it was designed to protest against land monopolies, which is exactly the opposite, of course, of the game that we now know. I'm not a big fan of Monopoly. I don't like that randomness. I don't think that the randomness that has meaning in Snakes and Ladders really has any meaning in Monopoly. But one of the cooler stories I know about Monopoly is that during the Second World War, copies of Monopoly were adulterated to be sent to English prisoners in concentration, or in prisoner of war camps in Germany. So they would have a silk map of Germany or of France and Italy embedded into the board or underneath the board in the box, and often they would even be shipped with real currency, with just a couple of fake notes on top, once they realised that these games weren't actually being checked carefully. So they were actually used to support escape plans. Lots of other popular mass market games date from the early 1900s, and it's interesting that we probably all grew up playing the same games, and the same games that often our kids are playing now. So games like Scrabble, which was invented in the late 1930s, Jenga, which dates to the 1970s. Cluedo was invented in a bomb shelter during the Blitz in London. And the name there is a mix of Clue and Ludo. Ludo isn't called Ludo in the United States, So in the United States, they just call this game Clue. And of course, Twister. Twister nearly didn't make it. Twister was produced and nobody would buy it. They wouldn't buy it because it was an immoral game. Interestingly, the publicist, after production had been cancelled, in fact, the publicist got a copy onto the Jimmy Carson show, the Tonight Show in the US, and he had Ava Gabor as his guest that night. And let's just say that the combination of beautiful movie star, low-cut dress and Twister meant that the next morning there was a queue of more than 50 people going down the street and round the corner from Macy's department store wanting to buy this game. And Twister kind of went from being this game that nobody would buy because they thought it was a bit naughty to a game that everybody wanted to buy because they thought it was a bit naughty. And if you look right through the 70s, there were all sorts of rumours of beachside wife-swapping parties involving Twister. So think twice, but no. But we all think of Twister, right? It's a bit of a kid's game, probably. I know I played it as a kid. So it's interesting to see the way that society looks at these different games. But then we move into kind of what I would call the modern era of board games. And really 1979 is the place where I would say that starts. A couple of things happened in 1979, but one of them was this game, technically Hare and Hedgehog, but in English it's called Hare and Tortoise, right? So it's a game about winning a race by being slow and steady. And this game is designed by David Parlett, who is now a very well-known scholar of games. He wrote the Oxford History of Board Games, Oxford History of Card Games. I met David Parlett at a conference and I was so overwhelmed that it took me 2 days to be brave enough to go up and tell him how excited I was to meet him. But this also brings us to the idea of authorship of games. So we're not used, when we think about Monopoly, we don't see by Charles Darrow in big print on the front of the box, or sadly by Elizabeth Phillips. We don't see by Leslie Scott on the Jenga boxes. But on these modern board games, authorship has become very important. And that's fantastic because if you like one book that an author has written, you're probably going to at least give some consideration to the other books that they've written. And there's a good chance that you will enjoy them. If you like one game that an author has designed, again, it gives you an entree into the other sorts of games, the other games that that person has designed. The other thing that happened in 1979 was the launch of the German Game of the Year award, or Spiel des Jahres. And the German Game of the Year award is absolutely the most influential prize for board games. It's also extremely reputable and extremely reliable. If you see a game with one of these symbols on it, you know that this game has been judged by a jury that is not affiliated with the industry, that is knowledgeable about board games, and it's been found to be a great game. The original award was the red one, right? It's a critics' prize. It's not a popularity contest. And that is an award for family games. So I would say that's games that you can play once your kids are about 8 or 9 and up, okay, as a family together. The blue award, yes, is the Children's Game of the Year. Children's Game of the Year, more the younger end of the market. All of you should be looking at the Children's Game of the Year award winners. And the black one is the Gamers' Game of the Year, right? Not perhaps so much something if you're just getting into board games in your toy library. It's more complex games and for adult targeted at adult audiences. That doesn't mean that it's an adult game, right? It's not strip Monopoly, because we always struggle with that when we say, I'm talking about board games for adults. It's like, no. But they are more complex games and more thoughtful games. So a couple of famous games that have won this award, the Red Award, the Game of the Year. Settlers of Catan won in 1995. And that's been a game that is now very well known in popular culture. It's not the easiest game to just pick up and start playing. The rules can be a little bit complex, but it's a very rewarding game, usually for 3 or for 4 players. By 2015, more than 22 million copies of this game had been sold around the world in 30 languages. Okay, so it's been very significant. Carcassonne, 2001. This was probably the game that converted me from being a casual game player to being somebody that really loved playing games. Like Settlers of Catan, this game the board is different every time, but unlike Settlers, you actually build the board while you're playing. I would say that Carcassonne is probably better known in Australia than Catan, okay? But this has been around since 2001. And is still enormously popular. When we would run game nights at my kids' schools, this was always the game that a couple of families would turn up and bring with them. And it's very familiar and very easy because if you've done jigsaw puzzles, you know how to play Carcassonne. This year's winner was the Quacks of Quedlinburg, okay, by Wolfgang Warsch. I've actually got a couple of games down here. I have this year's winner of the Game of the Year, the German Game of the Year there, and also the Children's Game of the Year, which is Dragon's Breath from Harbour, another really lovely children's game. And I also have there the 3 games that we awarded as Boardgames Australia with prizes last year. We offer prizes for Best Australian Game, Best International Game, and Best Children's Game. And our Best Children's Game award is specifically looking at games for children aged about 4 to 8. All of these, absolutely recommend, hand on heart. You could not find a better starter set of games for families. Very quickly, when we talk about games and modern game design, there are 2 very broad schools of design. We have what we call American-style games. They often call them Ameritrash games. I can't write that in an academic paper, so American style sounds much better. And American style games tend to have these highly detailed figures, right? Where European style games or Euro games tend to have wooden pieces that are more stylised. They also tend to have simple rules, usually take less than an hour to play. Importantly, there's no player elimination in these games. What that means is that playing a board game is no longer about getting kicked out. Right? Think about playing Monopoly. The way you win is to drive everybody else bankrupt and kick them out of the game. Okay? In these games, it's about being the first person to achieve something, perhaps the first person to get to 10 points, but everybody else might be on 9 points, or somebody might be on 2. Okay? They also have this is what we mean when we talk about positive scoring. All right? It's not about taking things away from people, it's about doing things yourself. It's not to say that American-style games aren't fun as well, okay? But they tend to be the games that are very high confrontation, high theme, often space themes. Zombies appear a lot in American-style games. Often different players have different abilities, and they have a much higher component of luck. So one of the interesting things about these different styles of games is what they do with luck. European-style games tend to be about managing luck. Luck means that a range of different things might happen. Some of them might be better, some of them might be worse, but you can cope with them, you can accommodate that. Whereas American-style games tend to be about, oh, whoops, I rolled a 1, guess I'm out of the game then, right? So there's a much higher luck component. I want to talk now about families and games and what my colleagues and I have called finding time for tabletop. Okay? Dr. Rainer Knizia, who's one of the most prolific board game designers in the world, possibly apocryphally, said that when playing a game, the goal is to win, but it's the goal that's important, not the winning. And this is a really good lesson and message for people who are playing family games, all right? It's not about winning. You're still having fun, while you're playing the game, and it's important that everybody in the game is working towards the goal of winning, but only one person will be able to do that. Now, when I look at why people play games and what people enjoy about games, there are 4 things that come up. And I'm sorry, I think I may have used slightly too small a font there, but I'll talk you through it. So materiality, being able to touch the components, to feel the components, to see beautiful components and to move them around is very, very important. Sociality, being face to face with other people while you're playing and having conversations. One of the people I interviewed for my research said, I've had game nights where I've gone to play games and we've ended up not playing anything because we were just having too much fun talking to one another. So playing a game is very much about spending time with other people. And I always say, you know, if you're giving someone a game, you're not just saying, hi, I quite like you, here, have a game. You're also saying, have a game and I'd love to play it with you sometime, right? So you're giving your time as well as a gift. Intellectual challenge is something that people talk about a lot from games. They like having something to think about, okay, decisions to make that are meaningful in the context of the game. And variety. Gosh, lucky we have toy libraries, isn't it? Right? Being able to play not just one game, but to play lots of different games. When I look at how parents make time for play, I find 4 things that they do. They change the time when they play, so they play while their children are sleeping. One of my daughters used to go to sleep religiously at about 7:30, so our friends would come over at 8 o'clock, come down the side and come in the back door, and we'd all be sitting playing games down the back of the house. It's all of those paranoid fantasies about things happening as soon as you go to sleep coming true, right? But coordinating and thinking about the time when you play. Changing the location. So I found 2 things there. I found people who were going out to play games because it wasn't so convenient to play at home. But I also found a lot of people who were having people over to their home to play board games at home because that was an environment where their children were safe and where their children were cared for and where they weren't perhaps having to invest in a babysitter. My husband always used to say, we could go to this game club, but it's going to cost us about a game and a half to pay a babysitter, right? So let's just have friends over. Some people change the medium, so they go digital. So I saw a lot of people who were playing board games on digital devices, on their phones, on their iPads, as a way to keep in touch with friends while not having to go out all the time. I've also heard some lovely stories about people with adult children who are travelling overseas who use those board games as kind of a sign of life. They know that their child is still active because if some random person had stolen their phone, their first move probably wouldn't be to go and take their turn in Carcassonne. And the other thing that adults who enjoy playing games do is, of course, they change the context of play and they play with their children. Now, when people play with children, when we think about those 4 elements, right? Materiality, well, children's games typically have beautiful components. They're visually very, very appealing, okay? There is sociality in that play, but it's very focused on the child and on the family. There's probably less intellectual challenge for the parents when you're playing a game with your 3 or 4-year-old. And again, variety is an interesting question. How do we get variety in the games that we play? I think that the sociality is the really important element here. I talked to people who felt that by playing games with their kids, they hoped to build future gaming partners so that they would have, now I think it's a bit naive, but so that they would have an ongoing connection with their child as a young adult and as an adult through play. I think that's very much a factor of luck. I've got 2 children. One of them, she's 21 now. She loves playing board games. She will come out to us for board games. That holds very true for her. Her sister, she'd rather go to the movies. You know, she's not interested in playing games with us, but she will sometimes, and she still identifies that playing games is something that we do as a family. What I think the sociality is particularly valuable for when you're playing with your children, and I know I'm preaching to the converted here, right, is just about spending time with your child and stressing to your child that they're important, right? You actually want to spend time with them and you want to do fun things together. So finding games that your child will enjoy. Now, one of the issues when you're playing games with children, or when you're playing anything with children, is always packing up. And I think that this is probably an issue for you as well, in terms of if you've got games in your toy library, wanting to have some sense that the whole game has come back and help people to do that. I managed quite a large board games library for a big event called PAX Australia. We have about 6,000 square metres of space, and we would have about 2,000 people playing board games at any one time. One of the things that we learned was about making it easy for people to pack up the game and to check that all the pieces were there. And I love this photo because it's a bag labelled 16 penguins. Okay? But simply by putting, that label on the bag, it means you're packing up the game. Oh, hang on a minute, there's only 15 penguins. Oh, look, there's one on the floor. Okay? My children learned at a very early age the word floor check. We always do a floor check after we play a game. This can be taken to extremes. So I just share this because I think it is glorious. This is a quote from somebody who says, "I have each player's pieces in one baggie. Of course they're colour-coded, so the red player's pieces go in a red Ziploc bag, except for purple, because it would cost thousands of dollars to custom order purple baggies." But he then went on and organised a Kickstarter crowdfunding campaign for exactly that, for purple baggies, right, for packing up games. So you can certainly take that to extremes. But thinking about how the game is going to be packed up, whether it's going to be packed up with all the pieces for each individual player in a separate bag, whether it's going to be packed up with different types of pieces together. And the tip that I would say, after having experienced this once or twice, is that sometimes the components list in the game rules gets it wrong. And I've had games that have sat out the back, right, waiting to be sent back to the publisher or asked for new equipment because the components list was actually wrong. So checking what's actually in the game, going online, looking if you think there's a discrepancy can be really important there. Now, Amy, when we were talking about setting this up, she said, "So talk a bit about your favourite games." Oh, that's always challenging. What's challenging about it is that my favourite games change from day to day, right? And they depend on who I'm playing with as well. But I've got a few favourites that have really stood the distance. So Make and Break. Does anyone know Make and Break? Yeah, there's a few. How fabulous is Make and Break? It's an Australian-designed game too. Okay, it's 10 wooden blocks and some cards is the guts of Make and Break. And what you're trying to do is copy the picture on the card with the blocks and then break it, draw another card, do the next one. Okay, this is my daughter. She was 2.5 there, and she taught herself to play Make and Break from watching us play it with her big sister. And she really enjoyed just playing it. We didn't need to set the timer, but she enjoyed that challenge of building these towers. So I would say Make and Break's great from about 3+. I was trying to be very scientific here, but I ended up with anything published by Harbour. Right? Harbour is a German company. They publish beautiful children's games. I'm very excited because they're starting to get into family games as well, with games like Karuba, which I know has been very popular with families. But Harbour games, they have beautiful components. They're always colourful. They're always well designed. And in fact, our Boardgames Australia Best Children's Game of the Year, Rhino Hero Super Battle, is published by Harbour, and Dragon's Breath, the German children's game of the year, is also a Harbour title, and I was really excited to see some Harbour titles over there against the wall as well. This one, Spot It, or Dobble, or Catch the Match. This is a game where you draw 2 cards, place them side by side, and there is exactly one picture that's the same on the 2 cards. Okay? Again, you know, there's my Eleanor at 2.5, happily playing this game. One of the things we notice playing this with lots of children is that children are often faster than adults, because children just go, oh yeah, that looks about the same, and leap in, whereas adults are going, that's what that looks like on that card, is it on the other card, you know, and being much more methodical, and that can be a much slower process. So this is a lovely game. It's also a very easy game to carry with you. So this was one of our favourite, we call them cafe games, right? Games where if we were in a cafe, if we were in a waiting room, if we were stopping somewhere, we could just get this game out and play it, and it was quite low. It didn't take up a lot of room in our bags, it wasn't a noisy game, it didn't interfere with other people's enjoyment, and quite often we'd get other children coming over to join in as well. Hully Gully, which I know was in the Sellout Kids. It's also called Beat the Bell, Tutti Frutti, Spot 5, Fruit Punch. This is, if I was going to pick just one children's game ever, this would be it. This is really about making 5. Okay? 2 and 3 make 5, 1 and 4 make 5, 5 makes 5. As your children gets a bit older, 4 and 2 and 1 don't make 5, but if you cover the 2, it does make 5. Okay? It's a game that feels like Snap. Originally they had a bell in there, now I think they've got a squeezy banana that you have to grab. It's a very fast game. I said earlier, my older daughter is 21. We bought Hully Gully when she was 6. Last year, she was absolutely spitting chips. We went to a game fair in Germany without her. She was upset about that. But what she was really upset about was that the designer of Hully Gully was at that game fair, and I got my photo taken with him. So she was very, very envious about that. This, if you are dealing with people who have children in sort of the early years of primary school, if you yourself have children or grandchildren in the early years of primary school, this is the game that you need, hands down. Another favourite that I'm delighted to see is back in print is Apples to Apples. Some of you might have played a game called Cards Against Humanity. It's not one of my favourite games, actually, but it's based on Apples to Apples, right? The idea is you have 2 decks of cards. One deck has adjectives, right? Smelly, and one deck has nouns. Grammar teaching tool, right? So you might pick up dirty nappies, my granddad, snowmen, cats, and trucks. Okay? Each player has a hand of cards, and they just need to select one that most matches that adjective card, right? Smelly. So, and then they might want to justify it. I think this is a fantastic game once children are starting to read independently, so probably about 7+, okay? But I think this game works best with an adult running the game. There are other games that children can play by themselves, but because this game involves awarding, you know, this is the smelliest thing, then it's often best with an adult taking that role on. Again, fantastic for those early years though. Another great family game, Sushi Go, probably about 8+ again. This is designed by an Australian designer, Phil Walker-Harding. He lives in Sydney, and I'll talk a little bit more about Phil in a minute, I think. But again, Sushi Go, fantastic party game, very, very popular. And it's popular right through up to sort of adults as well, not only for children. Still in that sort of 7, 8+ age, King Domino, which really kind of nailed all the European awards in 2017. It's a very simple domino-like game, but enormously enjoyable. I've taken this into work to play with colleagues at lunchtime and been asked to bring it back, right, because they've enjoyed it so much. My daughter goes babysitting, and she kind of has a bit of a name for herself now as the German-speaking babysitter who brings board games. And I think that she might stop getting business soon, because some of the families she babysits for seem to be finding it very expensive, because they go out the next week and buy whatever games she actually took over. And this has been very, very popular. I've kind of picked a genre here, abstract strategy games. Games like Blockers or Quirkle or Ingenious. Games that don't have a theme, but they're much more just about the spatial relationships between the pieces. All right? Fantastic games. Again, we say 8+. I reckon that most 6-year-olds would happily play these games with their parents, although they wouldn't necessarily be competitive. Ice Cool is a really popular newer game where you flick penguins around the board. Now, I'm always a bit wary about recommending this for children. It's something that you need to think about very carefully with the children that you're talking to, because flicking is hard and flicking can be frustrating if you don't flick the penguin very well. I'm notoriously bad at this game, okay, because I always kind of flick the penguin on its side and it just crashes into the wall, and it does get frustrating. So there are some families and some children who are going to love this game, and others who are just going to find that it can be a bit too frustrating for them. And the last one, I said I was going to talk more about Phil Walker Harding. Bear Park, his most recent game, was our Best Australian Game winner last year. And at this point, I think we've just decided that we hands down recommend anything that Phil has designed. This is a lovely, lovely family game about building a park for bears and koalas. They do note in the rules that koalas aren't really bears, but it's a very, very good family game. And his most recent game, I think, is called Gingerbread House, and it's about being a witch and enticing fairy tale characters to come to your house. So really beautiful themes, beautifully made pieces. I was trying to come up with my next 10 games, and I came up with about 15. And I was delighted to see that some of them are over there around the wall. So I saw Harbour Games, I saw Hully Gully, I saw Splendour, I saw Patchwork, and I'm sure that there are others as well. So lots of really, really great games for families to play. Oh, 6 Nimmt, which I think is in your pack. So lots of terrific games there. I think I'm going to kind of stop there and see if there are any questions. I could keep talking about games all day, right? I could go back to that slide and tell you all about those games. But I think that the key things that I wanted to point out are these ideas of materiality, so being able to touch the games, to do things with the pieces, intellectual challenge. People are looking for something to think about, and parents are looking for something to think about as well after their children have gone to bed. When they can't go out, so maybe they can invite friends over to play games or play games themselves. Yes? Hi.
Could you just, some toy librarians have trouble selling the idea of games to the families that are borrowing, and I think most people understand that games are good intellectually for the child, but could you give a couple of pointers of what the toy library people can say to families about the benefits of families getting together to play games and what learning they could get from that?
Absolutely. I think that one of the big benefits of playing games with your children is that they can be as expert as you. Okay, this isn't learning to cook where mum and dad know how to cook and they're teaching the children to cook. It's not learning to, cross the road safely or something where mum and dad are the experts. When you play a game is a bit of a leveller socially. Everybody's playing that game at the same level. So that's why, when I was talking about Catch the Match, Spot It, Dobble, that game, I talked about how children are often better at that game than adults. So finding things where your child can be the expert is really, really valuable. And that's a lovely kind of change in the way that family dynamics work, I think. That would be my number one selling point. You can talk to them about literacy, right? You can talk to them about numeracy. You can talk to them about the social skills of getting along with people, of being a good loser and being a good winner. But I think that being on a level with other family members is really important. The littlest family member still has a good chance to win. And that's not only the case with Catch the Match. Games like Make and Break, that one where you're building things and knocking them down, right? Often we'd find that older children are being very precise about how they place the pieces, so they're a bit slower. The younger children just kind of whack it all together, somehow it miraculously holds together, then they knock it down and they're straight on to the next one. So finding ways for families to interact. Carcassonne is another great example. We have a family member with quite a severe intellectual disability, but they're able to place the pieces and do that shape matching activity and still feel that they're playing the game, even if they're not actually, placing their pieces in ways that align with the rules of the game, which are beyond them. They can still feel that they're participating in this lovely family activity. Any other questions? Yeah. Back to my next 10 list, yeah. I can talk very quickly. Would you like me to tell you why I picked these games, like a sentence each? I'm seeing some nods. So Quicks is what we call a roll and write game. All you're doing is rolling dice and marking off numbers on a notepad. This is probably another 8 and up kind of game. A friend recommended this to me when I was travelling with my older daughter, and it became our cafe game for that trip. Every time we went out for coffee or for dinner, we would play this game while we were waiting for our food. It's a very small box and easy to carry. Patchwork is a lovely game about making a patchwork quilt. A lot of people I've talked to have said they've played it with people who were resistant to playing games, who weren't interested in games because they were attracted to the theme of the game. It's been very popular as kind of an after-dinner game as well for adults because it only takes about half an hour to play. And again, it's in a fairly small box. The box is about this big. Animal Upon Animal, well, it's a harbour game, right? So you guys know now, don't need to say anything else. But it's another stacking game where you're trying to stack differently shaped animals on top of a crocodile because that's what we do. It's, I think, 10 years old now. Marvellous game, and if you like make and break, then you will enjoy Animal on Animal. Downforce is a reissue of an older game, which I think I played as a kid, right, called Top Race, or it was often called, someone's Formula One game, whatever. It's a car racing game where you're not only moving your piece, you're moving other people's pieces as well. And that's really for that 7+ kind of age group. It was re-released in the last 2 years. Kingdom Builder feels like a big board game. It's about taking control of different kinds of territory, I suppose. And it's been very, very popular. Ticket to Ride is one that we call a gateway game. It's one of the first 3 games that a lot of people played when they started to look at modern board games. It's a game about connecting train routes across America or various other continents, depending on the version that you get. There's a European version, there are Indian maps, Asian maps. New York Slice in the middle there is a game about making pizza. But it's a game that really uses that adage of the person who cut it gets to choose last. So you have pizzas which score a certain number of points. One player has to divide the pizza up into an equal number of servings, but then they are the last person who gets to choose which serving they want to take. Machikoro is a game about building a city. You roll dice on your turn, and this is really what I talked about with the dice being, or the luck being, about giving you different options rather than one thing being bad or one thing being good. So you roll dice, and then your different buildings in your city will produce money, which will allow you to buy new buildings for your city. I didn't explain that very well. It's a very good game though. Fauna. Fauna is my favourite trivia game. There's a more recent edition called Terra, which is about the world, and one about America as well. But in Fauna, it's a game about animals, obviously, and it's a game where you have to guess how long an animal is, or how much it weighs, or which parts of the world it lives in. For people like us, people like me, when I play it, sometimes I know the answers, sometimes I guess the answers, and sometimes I'm fantastically wrong. But I've played this game with children who have known every single answer. How long is the tail of a dingo, or where does this particular kind of crocodile live? So it's a really fun game again, and it's a game that works really nicely if you want to play in teams. So team up adults and children to play together, or even families against families. Carcassonne I've talked about a lot already. Splendor is, Splendor's over there. Usually when I talk about a game, I try to talk about its story. I think the story in Splendor is quite weak. The idea is that you're mining gems and you're creating jewellery for noble people. Really what you're doing is buying cards and then using those cards to buy more cards to hopefully get a certain number of points by the end of the game. It sounds very, very dry. It's not the most engaging of themes, but it's an enormously popular game. Again, it's one of those games where people play it and they just want to play it some more. Last three, Agricola, the family edition. Agricola is a game about farming in the 15th, 16th century. So you've got pigs, wild boar, sheep and cows. You've got to go out, do jobs on your farm, build your farmhouse and grow your family so that you've got more people to do jobs on your farm. And that's a fantastic game. Ink and Gold is a lovely push your luck game where you're going into a temple to explore, a bit like Indiana Jones, and the further you go in, the riskier it gets. And the longer you stay in a particular part of the temple, the more likely it is that you'll lose all of the treasure that you've found. But you get to go in 5 times. So if you lose all the treasure one time, it doesn't matter so much. This is a really kind of exciting game to play. Children really love it. I used to play this with school kids all the time. And in fact, we got it when my daughter was in grade 1, I think. Grade 1 or grade 2. And I was reading the maths standards and it said, understand division as equally sharing things out and that there might be a remainder. And that's exactly what you do. Every room you go into in this temple that you're exploring, you share the treasure out evenly between the people who are in the room. So there are maths skills, but there are also important skills about, I lost everything, but I had fun anyway. Six Nimmt is a card game about which numbers are bigger than which other numbers, I suppose, is probably the best way I could describe that. Again, it's very fun. It's a game where players all play their cards at the same time. So, and it will take up to 10 players.
And it's called Six Takes in the one.
It's called Six Takes, of course it is. I'm so sorry. Yes. And the last one is Blink. Blink is like a racing patience type game where you're matching things based on colour or number or shape. This is a really interesting game because it teaches our children bad skills, right? It teaches them not to take turns because you've got to play your cards out as quickly as you can. And actually playing that with my kids, that was one of the hardest things for them to deal with. They would say, Mummy, it's your turn. I'm like, no, we've got to just play it as quickly as we can. And here I'm trying to kind of be a bit slow so that they'll get a couple more cards out. So I've tried to sort of have a range of different games there, but all games that I would absolutely say you won't like all of them if you try them yourself, but you'll certainly like most of them, and they're a great kind of starting set of games if you're wanting to have some games in your library, particularly that are sort of serving that next level of ages. So we've got a few for the younger players, but we've also got things for their brothers and sisters who maybe are in primary school. Yeah.
I have a question on that. Do you recommend a game that covers your preschooler and your early school starters? So you've got 3 and 4-year-olds playing with their 5 and 6-year-old siblings?
Absolutely. So 3 and 4-year-olds playing with 5 and 6-year-olds, I would go for Spot It or Dobble, which is the game about recognising the same shape. I played that recently with my nephews who are 4 and 7, and we had a great game playing that. Something like Make and Break, right, a dexterity game. Rhino Hero Super Battle, Dragon's Breath, any of those that are about manipulating the pieces in some way are also really, really good. And then depending on the preschooler, and how they're going with things like number, you might be able to play Hully Gully as well. But Hully Gully really requires the players to have a similar kind of understanding of mathematical concepts, right? Anything by Harbour, again, I'm being really lazy when I just say anything by them, but pretty much anything by them will be enjoyable and will have that built in that you can play it with different age groups. And the last one that I would say is something like Fauna as well, that you can play in a group and you can let your little ones guess where something is on the board. They can still put their pieces out because they don't necessarily have to win to have fun. And that's one of the big messages that I think we want to get across to people. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm sorry if you've already covered this because we were slightly late, but a big concern for us is sustainability, and it's heartbreaking to have 3 Boardgames behind the counter that have missing pieces. How friendly towards ordering replacement pieces do you think a lot of the suppliers might be? And have you had any experience with that in Australia Games?
Yeah. So that's a great question about how amenable the suppliers are to replacement pieces. I find them enormously amenable towards ordering replacement pieces. If you write to them and you say, we're a toy library, yeah?
I have a system where they'll send you any piece. You pay for it,
Yeah. So you won't be losing out. A lot of the games that I've recommended, and I know you want your games to be complete, right? But a game like Apples to Apples Kids, which comes with 250 cards, if a couple of cards make their way into mouths, right, or as I saw once, kind of up noses, it's not the end of the world with a lot of these games. Some of them, though, it is, but the board game publishers are very aware of this, and the replacement costs, some of them don't even level replacement costs, but if they do, they're typically very, very, very low. They will also often pack a couple of extra pieces into a game. So when you do your bit check, you know, when you get the game and you're kind of doing an inventory of the components, you may find that there are already a couple of extra pieces in the game. Some games you can replace pieces with fairly plain alternatives in the interim so that you don't end up with them stuck behind. And because you've got such a great big group as well, you may also find that over time, yes, there might be a little bit of attrition, but maybe between you can cobble together 2 copies out of what was once 3 copies. I do also recommend bags, though. Ziploc bags, write on the bags or make labels for the bags what's supposed to be in there. That really helps you to keep track of games. And you know, when I think about the library that I ran at PAX, where we had kind of 2,000 people playing at once, over the years I think we've maybe had 8 games with important pieces going missing, and we've been able to replace those. So.
We've also found that the older the games are aiming at, the much less pieces go missing. So the more your games are grow, the less pieces will be losing.
Yeah. And do teach them, though, about floor checks, right? They're very important. One of the most haunting moments of my life was teaching a game as the cleaner went past. We were in a school hall and just hearing this plastic train rattle its way up the vacuum cleaner pipe. So. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I think I'm at time, so...
Thank you, Melissa. That was amazing. I know many of us are looking at building our toy library collections into that older age range, and you've given us some amazing ideas to do so. So thank you again.
Thank you. And I would say look at Board Games Australia's website for tips on what to include. Look at the German Game of the Year website as well for ideas on what to include.
Great. And that's a little token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Now